We were sleepwalking our way into this sort of new economy, and we've had a bit of a wake-up call.
You may have noticed that the internet stopped working recently. A relatively minor AWS outage was still able to do hundreds of billions of dollars in damage, bringing down Fortnite, Snapchat, and a bunch of Canadian startups you might know fondly. That's not a good look for the sovereignty crowd, who are calling for Canada to finally build its own digital infrastructure. But what if I told you that Canada already had a sovereign cloud? In fact, many of them. What happened to them? How do we get control of our tech stack back? Ian Ray, CEO of Aptum, has been building the infrastructure of the internet since 1994. He's also on Minister Evan Solomon's AI task force to help us figure out this whole sovereignty situation. On this episode of the BetaKit Podcast, he explains why outages happen and what they reveal about the economics of the internet. Maybe why digital sovereignty is less about border control and more about control of our supply chain. So, how do we rebuild Canada's sovereign cloud? Let's dig in. This episode of the BetaKit Podcast is brought to you by the Cyber Challenge, powered by Rogers Cybersecure Catalyst and CCTX, your startup's pathway to sales, industry connections, and non-dilutive funding. Ontario's critical sectors depend on operational tech systems that weren't designed for today's cyber threats. Unlike IT, operational technology environments demand specialized solutions, and startups can lead the way. Join the Cyber Challenge's free webinar on October 24th to learn about the risks critical sectors face and how startups can seize this opportunity. Register today at thecyberchallenge.ca. Do you accept the challenge? Ian, man, thank you for doing this. I think what we're going to try and do today is use your wisdom and experience and deep history with how technology as a business has developed in Canada and use it to explain like the current moment that Canada finds itself in. That's going to be super easy to do. Where I want to start is with the AWS outage that just happened, because I think a lot of people recently when this went up, we're recording this just a day after, essentially, woke up to basically all of their stuff not working, degraded, or maybe they didn't even notice and they got the templated email, hey, just to notify you, because of the AWS outage, here's why these certain things didn't happen. So far, the estimation is like hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue lost. You know, Fortnite was struggling, Snapchat, Coinbase, a bunch of Canadian companies like Simple, Coho, just name your Canadian company that uses some network of internet services. They were having issues. I think it might be useful if we're going to have a conversation about like the history of the cloud in Canada and like sovereignty, just explaining how an outage like this happens. We can maybe do it like technologically how it happens and maybe what it infers about our infrastructure that it can happen. Does that make sense?
It sounds super unambitious, Doug, and really boring, and I'm totally up for it.
This podcast is awesome. Nothing if not ambitious. So explain to our audience, and by proxy me, even though I totally know all this stuff, how an outage at this scale happens.
Look, I mean, it's a great question because the details of it tend to always be different. And to my understanding, AWS is still unpacking, and at some point they will publish a blog post and we will understand the details of it. But at a high level, I think there's something that's amazing about these cloud computing systems is just the scale at which they operate, the number of services that are running that are dependent one upon the other. And so when you're looking at something like Amazon's AWS US East 1 region, it's really it's really kind of where cloud computing was born.
Okay.
It's where things got started back in the early 2000s. And so it really is by far like the largest, I guess, example of cloud computing at scale. And so what you have is a lot of services there that are running that are sort of fundamental building blocks of how the cloud operates.
Okay.
And these are services like, a good example would be Simple Queue Service, which is the first AWS service, I think, ever, right before S3. And really, it's just responsible for managing queues of messages that are essentially like instructions that are being sent out and to get processed. And so what appears to have happened here is that Amazon's got in any cloud region, every region is independent of the other regions. Yeah. And so this is a distinct region. And it has these messaging services and has these database services that many of Amazon services rely on, as well as their customers relying on it.
Yeah.
And so that sort of presents a sort of single point of failure, if you will, within the design of a region.
And so when you say region here, maybe I'll use like a telecom corollary, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. We don't know why, but there was an issue in the region which degraded service there explicitly. But then because that region has their bits messed up across North America, there's degraded service because the rest of the regions have to carry the load because core functionality is stored there.
I mean, this is where it gets so interesting is like, so the way cloud computing is generally organized at a high level is you have these regions that are really designed to be completely independent of each other. And AWS has many regions you can deploy to. It has multiple regions in the US East, and it's got regions in the West. There's regions in Canada. Mm-hmm. And how they're designed is to really be able to be independent of each other. So that if you have a failure in one region, as long as you are using multiple regions, you should be okay. And so I think this is one of the big lessons here is that the way cloud computing adoption has evolved is a lot of folks want to be in this particular region. It's where a lot of the AWS services are first released. So if you're an innovator, often, you want to be there. It's where a lot of other users are. So other applications are in that region. And so if you're building software that has to integrate with somebody else's stack, often they're in that region, and by being in that region, there's advantages, lower latency. You're not paying as much for bandwidth. So there's this set of effects. Another example would be just the sheer amount of data that's there. Is that often it is like economically much cheaper and easier and more effective to bring applications and users closer to where the data is instead of replicating the data somewhere else. So for all those reasons, despite the fact that the way cloud computing is designed is to be very resilient, the way it is generally adopted is often in a non-resilient pattern.
Yes. Okay. But that last component here is you're indicating, like, if anyone ever thinks of it's the cloud, it's just up there. It's not anywhere. It's the cloud. You are describing a circumstance where not only does the internet rely upon major providers like AWS. You could expand this out to Azure or Google Cloud. They represent like 90% of the market when it comes to this stuff, or like they eat up a whole big part of the pie.
It's a lot. I don't know if it's 90%, but it's a lot.
It's a lot. Okay. And then within one, they are broken out by regions, which have specific services, which have specific complexities.
That's right.
Which have network effects towards centralization, which means, one cell tower goes down, you're just trying to spread out the load to the rest of the network. This region goes down and it's like North American's tech neighborhood is done for the day. Is that?
Yeah.
close?
I think and this has happened before, right? It's like, I don't know, I can't remember exactly when it was, but let's say about 5 years ago, there was an issue with S3 in that region. And sort of the headlines the next day is kind of like the internet is down, but the internet's not really down. It's just that a lot of the images and objects that
Are stored in the internet?
right, that load when you load a web page happen to be, and many of the web pages themselves happen to be relying on that particular region of S3. And so I think that's the pattern that we're seeing repeat itself is every few years there's a regional outage. And the reality is that, and I just wrote something on LinkedIn today because I think it was important to say, as everybody's complaining about AWS in this instance, and we can understand why. At the end of the day, like the way these cloud services are designed, really in principle, if you have an application that you need to run really reliably, the onus is really on you as the application developer to use cloud best practices to actually architect the application so it runs across regions, ideally. And it might not be running across multiple regions all the time, but at least, at worst, maybe you want to have a business continuity plan where it's like, hey, if a region really, really has an issue, then we have an ability to actually run it elsewhere, right?
You can sell me on the business continuity plan at the end of this if we get through. Where I want to stick on is maybe the implications of like why that's required. And we're talking about, again, I almost wanted to ask you, what is the internet? But just that idea of the internet isn't down. You just can't access where most of the stuff is. And again, most of the services that people were using didn't go hard down. This wasn't like that one time that Facebook tried to do a DNS switch and goofed it up, which is like the most classic thing that you can do with a DNS switch. This was degraded services. And for most of the companies that were sending you an email, if you use some sort of B2B SaaS platform, or if you use a consumer platform that relies upon those other services, it was something like, hey, we didn't go down, but things that we rely upon to send you messages, to have integrations work, some other core component that we don't build, that we just plug into our stack, was down because it's hosted on this region. What does that say if the cloud is not only specifically located, but also across North America, you have Canadian companies relying upon services that are relying upon services and relying upon services that are then centrally located somewhere? Like, connect this to an idea of sovereignty, because sovereignty is hot. We've got our elbows up. We want, I think we want sovereignty, not isolation, or I will pull up a variety of Minister Solomon quotes. Sovereignty, not solitude. Let's get it right. We'll be accurate. A variety of Evan Solomon quotes about this stuff. We want to showcase Canadian innovation.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, is that not the current reality of how the internet functions?
Right. So in terms of like being able to, thanks to the internet, you have the flexibility to really run things, where you need to. You've got so
I mentioned like Fortnite and some other ones. I won't call out any specific Canadian company, but you're a Canadian company. Yeah. You are on the internet. You you build certain core IP and services, and you rely upon other things. If you were like, this sucked so bad, we want it to never happen again, we want to have an amazing experience for our Canadian customers, could they build a circumstance whereby if AWS or Azure or Google Cloud doesn't go down in this way, that they would be fine? Like, is that available to us right now?
So look, you can deploy on multiple hyperscaler regions in Canada and sort of meet sort of that notion of running services in Canada and having, let's just say, the services more under a Canadian jurisdiction, Canadian law, Canadian control. But I think just sort of starting with sort of this AWS outage, because I think it's really instructive, is like as you mentioned, is like this is the moment where people realize that stuff in the cloud has a location, and then that location has consequences for for how you get your services, and therefore, and you sort of don't notice it until there's a problem, right? On the sovereignty side, examples of moments where we've noticed that, oh, wait a sec, I never really thought this through, is when, in the earlier days of the pandemic, the impacts of closing borders and the flow of goods sort of exposed to many of us aspects of the supply chain of how things get to us that we just weren't that aware of.
And maybe our social infrastructure was as rickety as the supply chains, right? Like it's a stress
Sure.
test. Okay.
It's a stress test. And I think that's what's so interesting about these moments. And one of the things I feel like I learned at that time was that Canada no longer produced vaccines. I thought Canada produced vaccines at some point. We did, and then we stopped doing it. And that wasn't really thrown into light until you had that moment. So, and I think like, if you think about sort of just operations in the Canadian scene, right? A few years ago, we had Rogers who had a big issue with internet services. And I learned about it while I was traveling in the US, and suddenly my cell phone had no connectivity. And that's because all of my internet while I'm roaming goes back to Canada first. Yeah. And so for me, turns out it was a disadvantage that I had Canadian sovereign internet, because at the end of the day, the local internet was just fine. The problem was back at home.
Was the routing. And I think most Canadians probably remember a certain period of week where they couldn't buy groceries or do anything at a store, because you also then had businesses and then Interac relying upon Rogers to route all the payment infrastructure.
Absolutely.
And I think what maybe we're trying to convey here is like that the internet or the cloud or all this isn't one box concept. It's like a stack of turtles all the way down, and understanding where you are on the turtle stack is really important to understanding what you're going to get. And I guess maybe whether or not it seems like some of this is like kind of technological decisions, but also seem to be more like economic business decisions, or just like human course of behavior decisions that are like, it was just easier for us to ship in vaccines. So why would we make them here until, all of a sudden we really need to make vaccines here? Are we tying this together?
I think you're absolutely on the right track there. Look, as a technologist for years, I've struggled with the design decisions around sort of, building resilient systems, and sort of, working with internet protocol, which, really fundamentally, if you look at how the internet how the internet protocols are designed, and so many of the protocols that we use, like SMTP and DNS, which DNS is now, almost a household word after the latest outage. But
I would question. I'm looking directly in the audience, and I'm wondering if that's the case. I'm wondering if they're also just like, what the hell is AWS? Why can't the app that I use every day? You think of like kids who are younger than 20. Fortnite is their internet.
Yeah.
Like, it's the metaverse. They don't go anywhere else. They don't surf the worldwide web. I have no idea if they are completely disintermediated of that experience of like what's building that, or if it's just like Fortnite is down. Like, are they even typing things into a web browser to see like HTTPS in front of the URL, or even know what a URL is? Like, I wonder if those are becoming actually like more obfuscated as we get into a world where the internet are just these big, massive platforms.
Yeah. I mean, like I'm sort of the wrong guest to ask on that last point,
because I know everything about.
Yeah, very familiar with what Fortnite is, and I'm sort of more from the generation that was playing Unreal Tournament, maybe a predecessor to it. And so, if you wanted to play Unreal Tournament with your friends, you would
host your own server.
Online. You would host your own server. And what was interesting is and this kind of ties to our conversation, you had to find a way, with your group of friends, to find a location that was a fair location, because location actually matters on the internet. And the company that I'm CEO now, Aptum, actually started its life as a Canadian internet provider called Pier 1 Internet. And Pier 1's whole mission was actually providing customers with the best latency, the best paths on the internet so that you could get the best experience. And at the end of the day, like maybe the players of Fortnite, they're not thinking about is like, I want the best internet experience. They're like, I want the best Fortnite experience. It's up to the people who are designing that game and delivering that game as a service to figure out how do we make sure Doug, because he loves Fortnite so much, has a great experience playing Fortnite on his phone, in his man cave, when he's on the road with his laptop, and there's an enormous amount of work that goes into deciding how to deliver that. And I think when we have these moments, this is when it exposes to many of us what those underlying dependencies are that normally we're just not aware of.
Yeah. This week's episode of the BetaKit Podcast is presented by Xero, the cloud-based accounting software designed to help small businesses manage finances, streamline operations, and focus on growth. We asked small business leaders to tell us about why they use Xero and how it transformed their financial operations. Today, we're joined by Sean Hoff, the CEO at Moniker, a Toronto-based corporate retreat company creating memorable milestone experiences for organizations.
My name is Sean Hoff. I am the CEO of a company called Moniker. We're based in Toronto. What we do is we plan corporate retreats and offsites everywhere around the globe.
Okay, so how were invoicing, expense tracking, and reporting handled before Xero?
When we first started, it was pretty haphazard. We were trying to make things work with Excel sheets, trying to keep track of everything. And obviously that didn't work so well as the business grew. And so after I think it was about a year or two, we realized that we needed to figure out a longer term solution.
How did the team's growth and expansion into the US affect financial management?
When we first started, we didn't have that many projects going as a small business, and so our systems worked. But as we started to scale up, and I think in the span of 1 year, we went from something like 6 or 7 projects to like 20, 25. The systems that we have in place didn't work anymore. And so all of a sudden, with the projects that we're operating, we might have like 20, 30 payments coming in and 20, 30 payments going out, and multiply that by 20. Like it's a lot of data to keep track of. And I kind of liken it to you feel like an air traffic controller trying to stay on top of all of these flights that are coming in and out. But half your screens are dark. You don't know exactly if that happened. Did they land? Did they not? And that was kind of the point where we realized, like, okay, we need to figure out a solution that is going to actually help us keep visibility on all the tracking that was happening.
Why did you choose Xero over other solutions? Like, can you walk us through what the decision-making process was like?
What drew us to Xero was back then, it was one of the few accounting platforms that allowed multi-currency. So we have clients that are in Europe, we have clients that are in the US, we have clients all over, and it makes our business a little bit unique because we might be getting paid in euro, but then taking a group to Mexico, so we're paying out in pesos, and trying to kind of shoehorn that into a platform that didn't like foreign exchange, obviously created some problems. So Xero was very flexible around that. It tracked FX for us. It allowed us to stay on top of how those converted into our P&L statement in Canadian dollars. And that was kind of what really made it the winner for us.
And can you explain how Xero has changed the way you approach important business decisions?
Xero has changed the way that we approach our decisions because it has a very handy dashboard where we've set it up and customized it so that it gives us the data and the numbers that are most important to us. And it allows us to kind of look at trends and like where our operating expenses are. It allows us to look at revenue growth with specific clients or something. So we can kind of project, like, if the last 2 years they've grown at 3-4% per year, then I think we can reliably say that they'll probably grow by 3-4% next year. And just having those kind of analytics at your fingertips is extremely helpful to make reliable decisions.
All right, let's talk about cash flow management now. How is Xero helping with that?
The biggest advice I give to new business owners is cash flow is king. You might be doing a whole bunch of sales and you might think that business is booming because you've got revenue coming in. But if it's taking 30 days, 45 days, 60 days to collect that, you might go out of business before you see that revenue. So being able to see and flag revenue and like the time it's taking you to collect is really important to make decisions. If you're committing to things that you're paying out money sooner than you've got money coming in, you'll find a cash crunch. Using a software like Xero allows you to stay really, really on top of the cash flow in the business, but also just like forecasting what it looks like for next year or months ahead if you're worried about, are you going to make payroll? Simple things like that.
What advice would you give to small business owners in terms of goal setting?
A lot of businesses and people in general, plans are great until they don't happen. And as we've seen over the past few years between COVID, between 2025, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. It's what Mike Tyson says. And so for us, like we had a goal that we set 3 years ago, and not being able to necessarily see the end of this year at the beginning, but now with the clarity to be able to look into like how our books are looking, how things are starting to forecast and what the trends are, it's allowed us to really say like if it might not happen as planned at the end of 2025, like based on the numbers and based on the data that Xero can give us in terms of like percentages and growths, it's pretty easy for us to actually forecast what it looks like. So my advice to a small business owner would say, it's not necessarily how soon you might get to your goal, but being able to reliably look at the numbers and being able to predict when it might happen. So if it takes a few months longer or if it takes a year longer, but with certainty being able to see that trend and being able to see like, okay, I'm going to hit my goal just a little bit later than I expected, but it's pretty reliable. That's incredible.
Across Canada, businesses like Monaco are choosing Xero to manage their financial operations efficiently. Xero provides cloud-based accounting, automated workflows, real-time financial insights, helping companies take control of their finances and focus on supercharging growth. Join thousands of businesses using Xero to manage invoicing, reporting, forecasting, and more. You can check it out at xero.com. What you were just explaining exposes two things that we had talked about before that prompted this. One, in the modern example, the Fortnite gamer has absolutely no control over that experience. They're just trusting the service provider. They can't run their own server. They can't set up anything themselves. They can't host a local area network, have a LAN party and play together, connect their devices, because we gave up on that.
Those were the days.
Halo 1, which was also 25 years ago. So even like the mid-modern example makes me feel old and dead inside. They've just got to rely upon the service providers to make this always work. So that abdication of control, that we chose something that is a little bit more comfortable, that we're just letting it happen to us, is a thing. Other thing, and this was one of the prompts that we had to do this conversation. We were chatting at All In, the Canadian AI conference. It's kind of blown up over the last 2 years. I'm going to point some fingers here, and then some videos, podcasts from All In will pop up. I suggest that you listen to or watch them. But you had said, and this is bringing back to sovereignty before we get to the history lesson, that we need to understand that sovereignty is not, do we have stuff in our borders, but do we control our supply chain? I think in the AWS outage example, we're understanding how the geographical is like very, very messy right now. I want to maybe get back to that supply chain idea and just talk about sovereignty in this moment of 2025. Because you, sir, you're on the AI task force. I think you're in the infrastructure group. Yeah. You have been, called up in service of this national moment. Sovereignty is very hot right now. We were talking about defense tech before we were recording. Quantum, we need to keep all of our innovation and our leadership here. We're going to make Cohere a champion, all this good stuff. Explain to me how sovereignty works in a realm of not necessarily geography, but like digital innovation supply chain. Like what does Canada need to solve for right now in this moment where one AWS region going down can take out most of our favorite apps, and a Rogers outage can take down most people's capacity to, pay for food?
Yeah, and I think that's a really practical way to look at it, because I think, sovereignty is a big word. It's a loaded word these days. A lot of people have a lot of definitions around sovereignty. What I kind of come back to is much more practical and rooted in all of that all that experience on the internet, starting businesses and figuring out how can you manage the risk of dependencies when you're selecting suppliers, when you're choosing a location, when you're figuring out how to architect something, how do you make sure that you will have the control you need when you need it?
Yeah.
And I think it's the same problem.
So not even at the user level, you're talking about like the control decisions higher up the supply chain of like, again, the Canadian startup that's like, oh, well, we didn't go down. The service provider that we pay for to connect the other bits to do this thing went down, but our customers still saying, why no worky, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's lots of examples of businesses getting into hot water because they didn't truly understand the supply chain. They didn't understand the dependencies. And then something changes. And then they realize, now we got a problem. And often these can be as simple as what we were talking about before, is I happen to have just I'm going to deploy all my stuff into one of Amazon's regions. I'm going to happen to choose the one which everybody's in, which is the most likely place for something like that to occur because it's running at such a huge scale. And, a lot of businesses kind of have learned the hard way. I think when it comes to like being a country, and it's been interesting how this sort of has emerged lately, but I think it sort of does tie back to initially, perhaps the pandemic sort of made us think about what happens when you close borders and who do you rely on and how do you get stuff across the border and all that.
Certainly,
and I think
tariffs did as well. Right?
And then tariffs came along and then sort of really just kind of like piled on top of that, recently won knowledge. And now folks are actually pretty conscious and sensitive about like where they get things and how does it get here and what's sort of how reliable is that if push comes to shove? Mm-hmm. And I think like whether you run a business or whether you run a country or whether you run a household, like thinking about what you do in a situation where things aren't business as normal, or, it's just like if you have a household, you're going to be like, well, you might think about, and you have kids and you'd be like, what if we lose power? Like, what do we need to do to prepare for that? Right. And I think like everybody's kind of maybe got a different view on that. I know a lot of folks are going to keep a few days of food. If you're in Quebec and you go through what we went through with the ice storm, you might be like, well, it's actually, we've seen it where you lose power for 2-3 days, as much as a week or more in some places. And so you want to be prepared. And I think really there's a lot of value in what's happening now, because I think the sovereignty buzzword is really driving a lot of self-reflection, thinking about what do we really need to be able to run reliably, no matter what is going on out there in the world. And I think there's a bit of a spectrum. I think there's when folks get into the sovereignty question, it's often like a black-white thing. It's either I'm all Canadian, or I just kind of have like not just delegated, but I just abdicated to some foreign provider.
Yeah, well, you
often,
can buy this
right?
brand of chips, or you can buy this brand of chips, and one is the good kind and one is evil and must be destroyed, even though they're probably actually manufactured in Canada anyways, and there's Canadians whose jobs rely upon that certain brand of chips. Like we just had...
But that's complicated. We want simple, like just for the most part, like why do we need to think about that, right?
Yeah, why are we thinking when our elbows are all the way up, right? So when in this environment, when you're talking about this, I know we're using the term supply chain. Would that also be just synonymous with the idea of like infrastructure? Like is in certain components, is that the same thing? Is like we have control of the supply chain, we have control of infrastructure of goods and service delivery. When we're talking about like digital innovation, that supply chain is actually usually either physical, tangible, or digital infrastructure sending or controlling the bits. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, look, supply chain, I think sort of, broadly is like just all of the dependencies which are sort of standing in between sort of you and getting whatever good or service that it is that, you're looking to get. More specifically, you could look at supply chain as there is enabling infrastructure that kind of just needs to be there, or else you cannot have any flow of goods or services. And that's a little bit different than the actual flow of goods and services. So,
the
probably fair
economical
to,
profit and okay.
Sure. So it'd be probably fair to like distinguish between like if, we need roads and bridges for, us to be able to have traffic of various kinds. And then getting into the specifics of, do I use like a 24 wheeler to actually transport goods is a more specific supply chain decision.
Or like who's selling you the cars, who owns the toll booths, who like all of that stuff. Okay. And again, we're talking a little bit in metaphor here because we are trying to save you from the difficulty of unpacking 40 years of experience in this space into a 40-minute podcast. But I think now is a good moment to flip from, which brand of chips represents your national identity or like roads as infrastructure to the digital and technological. And I want to do that using the AI task force again. AI Minister Evan Solomon said, like, we are in a crisis moment. We have to capture and keep both our talent and the value of our innovation, our IP. He said this very specifically in terms of AI as like, a future economical driver. Also, quantum gets thrown in there as like, we kind of think that's the next thing, but it's not ready yet. And we don't want to lose that either. There's also some dual use defense tech component there. Again, I'll put a finger up. You can watch that episode. I don't want you to tell us what your task force recommendation is yet, because it's not due yet, and I don't think you tell me. I will tell this story though. At All In, I was talking to Ian, like, hey, like who's on this task force? Like, what are you hearing about this? Because we know it's going to be announced later this week. Because Minister Solomon had announced that the task force existence at All In. And Ian said, I know one person who is on the list, and I was like,
that was
man.
true.
And it turned out to be this guy. He's very, very smart information share. I should have thought harder about that. Nonetheless, let's use not your recommendations for the task force, but maybe an evaluation of what infrastructure or supply chain Canada needs to make sure we have control over AI. Do you think we can use that as a proxy to just maybe set up some thematic bands so that people listening and watching can understand how much we've got to do here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, this is a huge topic, obviously, but and look, AI is a huge trend. We do understand that there's a lot more computing that's happening out there that that isn't AI, but AI is really driving an enormous amount of the activity in the market right now. Yeah. And I think what's interesting about AI is at the end of the day, like it really is a data-driven kind of compute. It's like you are going to produce results because of not just the data that you have used for training the machines, but data is also required for the actual application to go and give you value, right?
The insights, the analysis,
So it's an enormous amount of data is needed, not just sort of upfront, but there's an enormous amount of data as well that is kind of continuously flowing through AI systems.
Okay.
That's probably important.
I think that makes more sense now in terms of why Minister Solomon would say sovereignty, not solitude, because solitude seems both economically not viable for Canada, but like also technologically, just logistically not viable in any instance of this era of technology. Going back though to the stack for AI, the things that we need for sovereignty, where is the focus on? Or maybe another way of asking this is, of those components, which does Canada actually have readily available right now?
Right. From a supply chain perspective, and obviously we've got
the power.
We've got abundant land. We've got power, although it's a bit lumpy and sort of, we have some capacity issues we've got to solve, but definitely those are ours to solve. I don't think anybody believes that it should be the business of another country to come and solve maybe our power problem. So those are the simpler ones. We have data center capacity that needs to get built out. I would say we're behind in terms of our infrastructure, to the example of like the roads and the bridges for the digital world. is like we've not developed, to keep pace, let alone to be a leader.
Cohere might be working with American companies to build some of those roads in Canada, which is a little bit weird as well. Just saying.
But these things happen when you have if you think about it, right? It's like when we needed vaccines, who did we turn to? It's like when you have something that's urgent, sometimes you have to find a way to fill the need.
Okay.
So look, I mean, it's not I think at the end of the day, like if you think about it, like where are the GPUs coming from anyways, right? They're not coming from here. They're not coming from North America at all. They're coming from overseas. And the global chip industry is kind of highly itself centralized. And so you have
just economies of scale, economic reasons. There was just a natural power law all towards Korea that just made it the most obvious place.
You have Taiwan. That's really probably the most notable region. There are others, but and that's why it's such a strategic location. And then you've got you've essentially got a lot of the supply chain is pretty distant from Canada and isn't going to get a lot closer anytime soon.
Yeah. Okay.
So it might take a different path. It can, come in the case of the Cohere thing. Maybe there's going to be a U.S. company involved. At the end of the day, I don't know the details of all that, but I think there's a legitimate question of like, hey, if we want to make sure that we have sufficient capacity for our needs in a world which is competing for these resources, how do we make sure we don't end up in a situation where we are unable, we've fallen behind, so we want to be able to catch up, and then we want to be able to have that sort of freedom to operate on a go-forward basis. That means that we need to make sure we really understand our needs, we really understand the supply chain, and we have a strategy that we can put into action. We know exactly how we will make it happen that will make sure we can deliver on the capacity when we need it and where we need it.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the process that Canada's going through, is trying to figure out where do we need to absolutely be able to count on ourselves and where can we count on others. And there's a whole spectrum from, are you a Canadian company to are you perhaps a Canadian trade partner to maybe
you're a non-American,
or maybe
industry,
to some extent you could be you could be overseas and maybe you aren't. We don't have free trade, but we still need to have a relationship anyways. This is a whole spectrum that you see layered over this whole complex supply chain. But I think when we look at Canada, like I think we have to really figure out like what specifically are the things we absolutely have to be able to control no matter what. And I think it's sort of useful to use these scenarios where we've seen where push comes to shove. Sometimes you can find out that you're not going to be the first ones to receive the vaccine for a variety of interesting reasons, right? And it doesn't have to be vaccines. It could be anything that is a supply that under some circumstance there's going to be a lineup. And so how do you make sure you actually are either at the front of the line, you have some kind of assurances, you have some kind of control of the situation, or in some cases you maybe have already thought it through beforehand and you've actually built the capacity that you need domestically.
And we're
right?
supplying it to the world.
Right.
We're the ones doling out. Okay.
So I think like for me, sovereignty is really about are we in a situation where we can control our destiny when it comes to the things that are most important to Canadians? So I give you a very basic example that I think is will resonate with many. Is like we have a nationalized healthcare system, right? This is something which all Canadians depend on, and so as a system which is distributed across the provinces, it's a system that we need to operate kind of no matter what else is happening in the world.
Yeah. It can't turn off or it can't be shut off.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And I think that when, and you must have had these conversations in your prior podcast around defense, there's certain things around how we organize defense where we know that when defense is being called into action, perhaps it's because there's some things have changed.
Yeah.
And
it's
so,
already too
so
late
do
to
we
start building
really
at that point,
understand what do we count on others for? And I think if you look at, NATO, like one of the values of those kinds of alliances is that we are committing to being able to count on each other. And that means that we can all do together things that there's no way any of us can do completely on our own.
Yeah.
And I think that is the principle. And so coming back to sovereignty, I think sovereignty should be in that context. And I think that's maybe a little bit what Minister Solomon's referring to, is like, sovereignty is not about going alone. Sovereignty is about really understanding what our needs are. What do we need to absolutely be able to deliver under all circumstances? And then how are we, counting on our friends, neighbors, allies, and all that to make sure that we can operate when push comes to shove.
Yeah.
And there's obviously been, we've been knocked off balance with some of the recent events. And I think we're sort of looking for like, what is the right balance? And I know a lot of folks are worried about, this sovereignty thing means that somehow like Canada's going to try to build everything itself. I think even if we wanted to, I think that is just a really sort of a naive and kind of, almost like dangerous point of view, is, because I think if we tried to build everything ourselves here, then we would likely actually fall back and not actually advance forward.
We'd be so busy replicating the pre-existing to again put that barrier up that we would not actually be driving the economy forward, setting ourselves up for the future, things like that.
Yeah, I think isolationist economies in the world, or those that get cut off for a variety of reasons, do not generally demonstrate that they're able to lead. Right? They're really, there's a huge tax and burden to trying to solve everything yourselves. Okay. So I think we just need to know, like, we need to decide, what are we going to be in the business of solving for ourselves? Who are we going to rely on for what? And then how are we going to make sure that when push comes to shove, that relationship is such that, it's not going to be simply someone tears up an agreement, because that seems to be sort of a popular activity in recent times, that there's actually like mutual interdependence. That's sort of how you get a more stable supply chain.
So is it less, again, that we don't run these things anymore, but we have less control and less leverage for the things that like we do run, so that when we need the potato chips, when we need the vaccines, when we need the Eastern region to stay up or whatever, we don't have some other offering to whoever's providing that to us to make sure there is economic equilibrium, rather than sole sourcing our whole way through.
Yeah. So I think like the healthiest markets tend to be the ones where you have an actual like competitive ecosystem. And so anytime you have sort of state intervention that excludes, significant players, or other examples would be maybe not excluding, but just sort of like using tariffs, for example, to just so severely disadvantage someone that, there's no point playing. Then you end up in a situation where you have less competitiveness, you have less resilience, and you're actually less able to actually keep pace with the rest of the world, let alone be a leader. So I think one of the things that we can maybe take advantage of is, I think Canada still has a lot of really great relationships in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think sort of if we're able to truly, again, understand what it is we're trying to solve, that we have to be able to operate on our own no matter what. And I think that's a more selective version of sovereignty than a sort of than a sort of hey, it's time for us to try to solve everything ourselves. I think maybe that's a path towards like better self-awareness, but also lower risk and better success. I mean, there's a certain like art of war element to it. It's like where it's like, Sun Tzu is kind of like, if you're going to get into conflict, you really kind of have to deeply know yourself and know your
Yeah.
capabilities and what you're good at, what you're not good at, and all that. And then you got to know the whole landscape. You got to know who your opponents are, and you got to know who your allies are. And like, I think it's that level of self-awareness we kind of lost over the years.
Yeah.
I kind of feel that we were sleepwalking our way into this sort of new economy, and we've had a bit of a wake-up call. And I think that's I think getting to know ourselves better is actually going to be nothing but a good thing for us.
Because we talked about letting the world happen to us, and I'm wondering how much of it was just like, wow, it would have been really hard to push against, again, these incredible offerings, but then again, that economic natural gravity of consolidation, right?
Yeah. So this is where, like, in the early days of cloud, and it was probably about in the 2011 sort of range, is like, Bell Canada was building a cloud, and we actually got hired to help build that. At the end of the day, it didn't launch. And what was, I remember being very disappointed by this, because I was like, okay, Bell's going to like provide a Canadian infrastructure as a service, and that's going to be really useful, because we saw at Cloud Ops, because we were helping so many folks get in the cloud. There was it wasn't certainly the majority of our customers, but certainly there was a pattern there of customers who were like, you know what, I'd love to be in the cloud, but I have a number of reasons why I just cannot run on AWS, Microsoft, or whatever.
Yeah.
Minority of the market, but we kind of saw this pattern early on. We were like, we'd really love to have an option for these customers.
You can still get the
right?
Canadian option if you need it, want it.
Exactly. And some of them, had extremely legitimate reasons, and others just was a comfort level. So there's a whole spectrum of like reasons why. But, what was really interesting and disappointing actually to me, but it was a lesson for me, is like Bell at the end of the day was not willing to actually launch the cloud publicly and make it actually generally available. And at the end of the day, the reasons were a number of business reasons, and it's fine. But like, we had to sort of be like, oh, well, what are we going to do now? Right. And so what we did was what maybe sort of anyone with an overdeveloped sense of agency in the world does, is you go and actually build the solution, because you can't find it elsewhere. And so that's what led to us building and launching ultimately in 2014 cloud.ca. So we started that project in 2012. It was launched in 2014, and ultimately was sold to Hypertech, which is a Canadian player, and who was in the business of building out cloud services at the time. They're a very infrastructure focused business. Was already thinking about AI, and today is a significant player in sort of the evolution of infrastructure in the Canadian scene, which is great. But what we found is that it was very difficult in practice to get cloud.ca off the ground. We managed to get it running in multiple zones, I think in 3 zones in Quebec and multiple zones in Ontario, and started really getting some traction there. But at the end of the day, we were really too early for, the Canada hadn't had its moment of sort of self-reflection.
The elbows weren't up,
right?
It was still it's still so much cheaper. It's so much easier. Why don't we choose these guys? Our neighbors to the south. It's like, no one will get fired for choosing Microsoft, Amazon, or Google, but choosing the local guy. We just did a whole episode that you can check out on why Canada doesn't buy Canadian, and I feel like this might have been a component to it, in addition to your competition is 3 of the largest companies in the world.
Yeah, I mean, we experienced that a lot, but the interesting thing about being Cloud Ops is like we were partners with AWS, we were partners with Microsoft, we were partners with Google. We just needed an additional option. And so that's why we created, and we had the cloud engineering expertise to actually build a cloud, and we knew what it took to operate one. And so we delivered it to the market. It fit a certain need at the time, but its real time kind of hadn't come yet.
Yeah.
And I'm totally cool with that. Like, timing is everything when you're building businesses. But we did learn a few interesting things on the way, however, which an example is like we at one point chose a data center in Quebec that was actually built by a friend, a guy named Jason Van Gaal, very talented engineer who just had a lot of passion for data centers and built a really great data center called Root in Quebec. And so we deployed one of our zones there, and then Root started to grow, and then it ultimately got the attention of Amazon Web Services, and so Amazon actually moved in and became a tenant alongside us. And the next thing we know is the data center was sold to a data center company that was not under the control of my friend Jason. And at one moment, we had that push come to shove, and I got a call from the president of the data center company, and they said, "Look, we need to get all of the other tenants out of this data center in the next 3 months." And so it was a bit of an interesting lesson in supply chain management to realize that our cloud zone was going to get pushed out of a formerly Canadian data center by one of our partners.
Yep.
So but that those things happen, and I think those are the kinds of things that we can think about to make sure that, look, at the end of the day, if you need to make sure your infrastructure doesn't end up in that situation, there are things that could be done to make sure it doesn't end up in that situation.
Yes.
Like that was on me. I didn't sort of, think through kind of all the potential consequences. At the end of the day, there wasn't an enormous amount of harm done because all we had to do is just migrate one zone. But it is an example of the stuff we were talking about before, and sort of really understanding your supply chain and knowing sort of what your options are when push comes to shove.
There are probably some things you could have done. It might not have changed the overall mass movement, except for now, we are in this moment where beyond business considerations, we are looking for something a little bit more. So with what we discussed off the top, and you, I think, correctly saying Canada has to be smart about where it chooses sovereignty and ownership of this infrastructure and where we play as partners, and then just walking through that history of like how we got here. To close, I want you to lay out what you think in this moment Canada should be focused on owning and developing, and maybe rebuilding, or in fairness to you, supporting what is still currently here and expanding upon it. Like where should we be putting our limited and targeted chips now, knowing the moment we're in and knowing the history?
Right. Yeah. So, and I want to make it really clear is cloud.ca is not the arrow of Canadian cloud. Okay. There actually are Canadian clouds that exist today. You've got, shout out to ThinkOn, who's doing some great work, and is in fact doing a fair amount of work with the government. You've got Micrologique in Quebec, who also has a fully Canadian cloud that actually does a lot of work as well with the Quebec government. So there are multiple players. I would argue the ecosystem is not where it needs to be to support the needs of the Canadian economy, and I think that's sort of one of the concerns.
Okay.
And then I think there's an opportunity here where if we really sort of use that lens of a more selective sovereignty, not a let's figure out how to kind of reorganize everything, but think about where we need to be able to control our destiny and own our destiny. Defense is a good example of an area where we're going to be spending a lot more money, where we need to, in many cases, have systems that are sovereign. Healthcare is another area where there's clear need in many cases for sovereign infrastructure. And, I think the list goes on. We have like a very strategic agriculture industry.
Yeah. Okay.
So when we start thinking about things like food security, when we start thinking about our natural resources and mining.
Yeah.
So
let's not start with Fortnite. Let's start with the things, again, that Canadians all need to make sure that they have so that we can continue to exist and thrive as a country,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Yeah. And I think like taking advantage of the fact that there are a lot of partners who have invested a lot in building infrastructure in Canada as well, that isn't necessarily Canadian owned and operated, but is still a part of our critical infrastructure. And we need to make sure we're making the most of that.
Yeah.
And I think that is sort of the message I'd like to come through, is that it's not about either or, it's actually about and really understanding what is the right place to run the right workload, right? And where do we make sure that, how do we make sure we have the right data in the right place? I think is the kind of self-awareness that we should all aspire to developing.
Okay. Well, man, you walking us through this with this level of detail makes me really, really glad that you're on that task force. I don't know what the outputs of that are going to be or the outcomes, but I'm glad there are at least other people in Canada listening to what you have to say, man. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
It was really awesome taking this wild history tour with you.
All right. Well, we'll have you back on again just to do one just on lands.
Awesome. I can't wait. LAN party. Oh, sign me up.
Awesome.